There's a very thought-provoking and concerning article over at Politico. It's titled "Combustible: Trump's Pivotal Moment with Iran," and points out that Iran is experiencing some considerable internal turmoil. The same is true of both Lebanon and Iraq, which Iran largely controls or has considerable influence over. And that our policy toward Iran has basically, by pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal and reversing the process of improving our relations with that country, we have just wiped out any ability to play any kind of reasonable role in that area. Brett McGurk, who was the special envoy overseeing the coalition to fight ISIS for the Trump administration, said, and I quote, "There's a real risk that over the coming months, Iran does something in the Gulf or elsewhere, and you've had no deliberative process of which the president's been a part to assess courses of action." On the line with us is Jamal Abdi, the president of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, N-I-A-C. NIAC.org is the website, and you can tweet him at jabdi, J-A-B-D-I, or at NIAC Council, or NIA Council. Jamal, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Tom.
Your thoughts on my setup here from this article in Politico?
The situation continues to get more and more dangerous. This, what we saw in Iran last week with protests, the escalating back and forth of threats, this is all predictable. This is all part of the maximum pressure campaign. Iran is under pressure from the United States. There are these massive sanctions in place. There's a near total embargo on Iranian oil, and we are seeing the Iranian government take countermeasures and lashing out. And even with the protests inside the country, I think Mike Pompeo and others in the Trump administration thought this was some kind of victory. I don't think 200 people being killed in the streets is a victory. I don't think that's going to lead to a democracy. I also don't think it's going to lead Iran to capitulate. I think it's actually going to trigger Iran to continue to escalate its own pushback against the United States. So this is a combustible situation that's getting ever more combustible every day that it continues.
I had this conversation with somebody, it might have been you, sometime in the last 4 or 5 months, just wondering out loud, has there ever been a time where severe sanctions have actually altered the behavior of a government? Severe sanctions being imposed by the United States. It certainly didn't change Cuba. To the best of my knowledge, it hasn't changed Iran's behavior. If anything, it's hardened it. Our sanctions against Iraq killed 500,000 Iraqi kids, because we wouldn't provide them with chlorine to chlorinate their water. But, Saddam Hussein didn't change anything. I mean, it seems to me like this policy that Trump is pursuing is punitive, but is probably not going to have the result that he claims he wants, which is, to bring Iran into, into some form of democratic governance. Your thoughts? No,
yeah, you're absolutely right. Sanctions that are aimed at regime change have not worked. I mean, you may be able to collapse an economy, but I don't think there has been any instance
like we're doing with Venezuela.
Like we're doing with Venezuela, like we've tried to do with all the examples that you mentioned. Sanctions, far be it for me to advocate for sanctions, but the idea is you have a specific goal that you want. You want party X to do Y, and you're going to impose sanctions with the promise that they'll be lifted if that party actually does what you want them to do. In this case, Iran actually did what we wanted them to do with the nuclear program and the nuclear deal, and we pulled back on those we pulled back on the relief. So now we're issuing these sanctions. It's unclear what Iran would have to do to get out of the sanctions. There's no pathway out of it, and even if they do that, I don't think inside Iran anybody believes that the U.S. will actually make good on its word. So like with Iraq, where we essentially, the United States essentially said, our policy is regime change. There's nothing Saddam can do to get out of these sanctions, but we're going to sanction him. Well, we saw what that did to Iraq. We saw how it destroyed Iraqi society. We saw the humanitarian impact. We saw the way that it actually enriched the authoritarian rulers of Iraq. And now we're saying the same thing with Iran. It's hard to, it's sort of, the dog that caught the car. Okay, now you have these protests inside of Iran. Now what? What's the idea here? How does this actually get better?
Right. Yeah, and I'm not seeing an answer to that question. To what extent is Iran embedded in the political and economic infrastructure of Iraq and Lebanon, and to what extent might those relationships represent the probability or possibility of any kind of conflict with Iran turning into a regional conflict that could turn into a regional conflagration?
Yeah, I think that's the nightmare scenario that I think is getting more and more likely. I mean, Iran obviously has a lot of power inside of Iraq, both with the political leadership as well as the security infrastructure and the Iranian security forces being embedded there or advising or having these militia groups inside of Iraq. So Iran exercises a lot of power there, and obviously there is protests now inside of Iraq against really the economic conditions, but Iran is taking a lot of the blame for that. And then with Lebanon, Iran's support of Hezbollah gives it, serious influence. Hezbollah is its own actor. It's not necessarily a proxy of Iran, but it is a client of Iran. And I think, the really simple way to view the Middle East is right now it's a contest between Iran on one side, along with these, whether they're proxy groups or the political leadership in the case of Iraq or an insurgency in the case of Yemen, against the U.S. and its allies, Saudi Arabia, Israel, some of the Gulf states. And we are actually seeing this problem between, this proxy war between the two parties, whereas in 2015, the hope was you put out the nuclear fire. You take that off the table, and then you actually enable some opportunities to find resolutions to these other issues. Actually get Iran and Saudi Arabia to start talking to one another. Eventually get Iran and Israel to start talking to one another. By abandoning the nuclear deal, we're now hardening those divides, and there's no clear end goal in sight other than we win, Iran loses. And if that's going to be the case, then we're going to have to be prepared for this total conflagration and a really costly either this simmering, proxy war or an all-out, real war between the two sides.
Yeah, and Israel has been making basically peace and peace is not literally, but is working basically with some of the Sunni states against Iran and some of and now Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen, the basically Shia states. And, here we've got this, 800-year-old conflict that is, on the verge of breaking out. During the Obama administration, the explicit goal was to bring peace to the entire region and to try and bring people together. Do you know that if there is any Middle Eastern policy that can be defined that has come out of the Trump administration? Have they said out loud, this is our policy, even if they're not following it? I mean, is there any sense of a policy at all? Has Mike Pompeo said anything?
I think the Trump administration has become a playground for ideologues to experiment with the fantasies that they've had for many years.
Or to act out what Fox News tells them to do, it seems.
Well, there's the ideological bend of a lot of these advisors who I don't think are operating in any sort of concerted way, so you don't have a real U.S. policy. And then you have, more so than I think any other point in history, personal political ambitions defining what is happening in the region. So, of course, Israel and the way that Israel, the role it plays in U.S. politics has always been, an outsized role. But now you have a president who is just giving things away to Israel explicitly for his reelection, explicitly to try to build support among evangelical and, pro-Israel voters. And I think that sort of that naked politicization, it's also the case inside of Israel with what Netanyahu is doing, facing this indictment and what he may do to try to save his own political skin. So there's no real policy in place other than protecting your own skin if you're Donald Trump or you're Benjamin Netanyahu or you're one of the other players in the region.
Yeah.